Well, good morning, everyone. I want to give a shout out to our friends in Gallup as well this morning. Tara and I've mentioned this before, recently entered into a new phase of life. We call it the empty nest years, and we are loving it. But I'll tell you, there are a lot of things that are absent in our lives, and some good, some bad, but the reality of running to activity after activity after activity is no longer part of our narrative in life. But I do really cherish those years of being involved in baseball and basketball and my kids' activities. And over the years, because my kids ended up playing a little bit of basketball, maybe up through middle school and so on, I got to go to a number of referee clinics on how to referee basketball, which was really good in helping me understand the game. And one thing that was really insightful in understanding how to referee basketball is that if there are two referees, there is what's called a lead ref and a trail ref. Now, the lead ref is the one who's like on the baseline, like right underneath the basket. And if he's on the right side of the court, he has a specific zone that he is allowed to make calls in. So that particular zone would be right there on the baseline where he is and in the lane. The trail ref, standing out near half court, he's the guy who really kind of covers the other 2/3 of the court and makes calls there. So with that knowledge, I was also at times a coach on some of my kids' teams. So when I would help coach, there was one thing that really irritated me about referees. Actually, there are many things that would, I can lose my religion in that. But what used to make me really, really angry is when the trail ref, who was supposed to be watching this big specific area, would make a call in the lane. And I would always yell, "That's not your call," because it's outside his zone. Now, there's another way that referees or umpires can exist within some kind of sport. In fact, if you go back a couple thousand years to the Greco-Roman games, every competition had an umpire, a single umpire. There was no zones. He had control over the entire sphere of everything that was happening. He had autocratic control to do whatever he wanted within this particular arena. Now, you go back to the ancient world and the way they viewed theology, there was really those two competing ideas. In fact, most countries in the ancient world would have existed with the mindset of, we live in a zone, and within this zone, we have gods that are control of specific zones. For example, they would say that we have a God that is in charge of fertility, and a God that is in charge of the sun and the moon and the rain and medicine. All these different things were zones for specific gods. And even again, if you are carted off from one country into exile in another country, you basically have the mindset that we've entered into a new zone with new gods. And our God or our gods no longer have control of my life. But there's also the idea that God and God alone has jurisdiction everywhere. All of creation, all of the universe is a sphere under his control. And so basically one of the things that we find in the book of Daniel, we're going to be in the book of Daniel today, and I'll go ahead and let the cat out of the bag. It's page 638 in the Bibles in the seats in front of you if you want to go ahead and get that ready. But in a little bit before 600 BC, the Babylonians began to conquer Jerusalem and Judea. That came to culmination in 586 BC. And as they captured Jerusalem and Judea, they began to cart off many people, especially many of the nobles and the wealthy, carted them off to Babylon. And the idea for many people who were carted off was, well, since we're no longer in Jerusalem, we're no longer in Judea, we've entered into a new zone where gods have authority here. But there were a few, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who understood that no matter where they were in the world, they were still under the jurisdiction of God. They still had God as the complete and total authority of their life. And that's the backdrop by which we're going to approach the book of Daniel. And even though they entered into a world that was less than ideal, they still understood that they were under the jurisdiction of God. So I want to ask a question as we think about our world today, as we think about our existence. And the question is, how do I live under the jurisdiction of Jesus in a less than ideal world? And I think that Daniel chapter 1 is an excellent kind of model of how we operate in a less than ideal world. So let's just go ahead and dive in and look at verses 1 and 2. It says, during the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure of the house of God. In doing so, he also carted off a lot of the kings, a lot of the nobles, a lot of the royalty, a lot of the really movers and shakers of Judea, and put them in Babylon. So they were given a new home. And the focal point of our message today will be Daniel, but also Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we'll find out a little bit about them in a couple weeks as well. But this new place was different. You see, when they were in Jerusalem, they had the temple, and they had temple worship, and they had priests talking about Yahweh continually. And now they're in this new home, and they are surrounded by pagan worship, and they are surrounded by pagan images, and they are surrounded by pagan people. And so it was an absolute reminder that their new home was a stark contrast to the old one. But notice verses 3 and 4. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning and gifted with the knowledge and good judgment that are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. So they are given a new knowledge. They are probably taught a new language and new ways to look at life. And they are being taught in many ways that we would use this word today, the worldview of Babylon. They understood the worldview that they were moving from, and he was wanting to expose them to something completely different. But also notice verse 5, and verse 5 is actually going to be kind of a pinnacle point for us as we move forward it says the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. That's a big deal. He says they were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter royal service. Now, the king giving his wine and his food to these young men was a big thing, but it was also a life-altering thing for Jewish people, because many of these foods that they were eating in Babylon were not like the kosher diet. They consisted of unclean food, things that they had never eaten in their life. And not only that, they were probably meats that had been sacrificed to idols in their pantheon of religions of the various zones and jurisdictions of those gods. But then we get to verses 6 and 7. It says, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. And so when you think about these particular names, Daniel, which means God is my judge, like ancient world did not name like children based on these are cute names, right? Or these are trendy names. There was purpose behind the names. And so Daniel is God is my judge. And they changed his name to Belteshazzar, which Bel will protect. And so Hananiah means God is gracious. Now Shadrach, inspiration of the sun. That is pointing to, again, one of the pagan gods. Mishael, God is without equal. Yahweh is without equal. Now Meshach, belonging to Aku, one of the gods in their pantheon of gods. And then Azariah, the Lord is my helper. Now Abednego, and that is servant of Nego. You see what is beginning to happen here, and we have to understand Nebuchadnezzar's goal. Nebuchadnezzar's goal was to change their identity and their worldview. He wanted to change, like, not just their name, but how they saw the world and how they approached the world. If you want to look at what is going on in our world today and what has always gone on in the world, there's a goal of many people to take those who follow Jesus and chip away at who they are in Jesus, and then change how they see the world, and eventually change how they operate and live in the world. But now we see, as we read on, which is really kind of interesting to me, is like there was a principled stand. There was a principled stand that these guys made as they were in this less than ideal world. Let's look at verses 8 through 16. We're just going to kind of work through this here this morning. It says, But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. And I think that is important. But he says, but he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. So you have to think about this. Kind of gives you an indicator of the tyrannical power of Nebuchadnezzar and the way in which he operated. It was it was a whim. It was not deep thought sort of things that would lead him to execute people of even within his own government, those who were considered to be loyal to him. Daniel then spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. Daniel said, this is the veggie platter. Okay? And then he goes, at the end of 10 days, see how we look compared to other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his three friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned to the king. Now, please understand that there's a thing called the Daniel diet. Anybody heard of the Daniel diet? This is not a biblical mandate for everybody to eat the Daniel diet. Okay, so let's just settle there. But so after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of food and wine provided for the others. Now, we're going to read on here in just a few moments. But I want to ask the question and let this kind of swirl around in your brain as we're moving forward, because I think that there's something here that we don't always talk about when we go into Daniel, and especially Daniel chapter 1. Why did Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah take a principled stand with food? Why was this the area that they stood up and said, we will not compromise? We will not move in this particular area. And we could talk about clean food and unclean food, or kosher food and unkosher food. I think it might be deeper than that. But let's go ahead and read on to the end of the chapter. God gave these four young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of wisdom and literature. Unusual aptitude. I think it's beautiful. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meaning of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, and we talk about training period, when the indoctrination period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked to them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. When the king consulted with them in any manner requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters of his entire kingdom. Notice this last verse. Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. If you do the math, Daniel was in the cabinets of 4 kings over the span of 70 years. That's no small thing. After 3 years of indoctrination, after 3 years in soaking in the government propaganda machine, after 3 years of the University of Nebuchadnezzar, after 3 years of a new name, after 3 years of the veggie platter and water, how many of y'all would get tired of the veggie platter? It'd take me about 2 days, by the way. These 4 men excelled more than any of the other people in the entire propaganda program. And Daniel endured for 70 years serving in the cabinets of pagan kings. But I want to wrestle with Daniel 1 for a few moments. I really want to wrestle with Daniel 1, because one of the things that we often look at is the idea of Daniel is a book of no compromise. And I think there's much to be said about not compromising our faith. But it is interesting to me that when most people talk about Daniel chapter 1, I mean, the titles of the sermons are things like Dare to be Daniel, right? Or Arise, Don't Compromise. Those sort of things about the book of Daniel. But here are some thoughts about Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah as we think about these. And I want to wrestle with these particular things here. And one of them is this. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah did not make an issue out of every issue. Let's think about this here for just a moment. They did not wage a culture war against the paganism running rampant in Babylon. I mean, what is a major call of many evangelical churches today, and I have probably been guilty of that we are in a culture war, and that we are to be culture warriors against all of the garbage that is going on in the world around us. Isn't that what we hear a lot? Isn't that what we hear that even in what we would call the religious right in the United States of America, that we have to fight this battle. But see, I look at this, and these four men, Daniel and his friends, they were engaged in a tyrannical and pagan propaganda machine of the government. They took a full ride to Nebuchadnezzar University to be schooled in pagan thought and pagan ways and pagan worldviews. Now, the alternative was probably death if they chose not to do this. But they didn't. They even took on new names, reflecting the godless culture of the people around them. They stood up to food, but I might dare say that in many Christian circles today, we might consider these four young men pariahs. Not for the stand that they took, but for the stands that they did not take. Because we would look at that and say that they should have taken stands on more than just food. And so I think we need to wrestle with that. Also, one of the things, in fact, an Old Testament scholar, as I was studying Daniel 1, mentioned this, and I'll paraphrase what he said, is there's no ideal society this side of Jesus' return. There really is not. And sometimes we fall into the trap of feeling like it is our goal as Christ followers to fix the culture in such a way that it's best for Christians. And I'm going to say that it is not our purpose to fix culture. It's not. It is our responsibility to live in the world in such a way that we help connect people to Jesus. More than anything else, we live and exist in this world so that we can help draw people to Christ, not fix the problems of culture. And that's probably a message that many of you are intellectually fighting against right now. I mean, I look at the early church, they did very little to speak out against culture, but they existed within it. In fact, there's some verses from the New Testament that I think indicate maybe what we are called to do. In fact, do you know that the hours leading up to Jesus' death, he was praying for you? That's pretty amazing. Praying that all who would ever believe. He was praying for us. But one of the things that he prayed in John chapter 17 is this: I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but to keep them safe from the evil one. In other words, I do not want them to live a monastic life apart from culture. I am asking that you keep them in the world, but you protect them while they're here. Also in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, it says, look, I am sending you out as sheep among wolves. This is not ideal for us. So be as shrewd as snakes and harmless as doves. In other words, you're going to have wisdom when to take a principled stand and when not to take a principled stand. In Ephesians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul says this: so be careful how you live. Do not live like fools, but like those who are wise. Make the most out of every opportunity in these evil days. Do not act thoughtlessly, but understand what the Lord wants you to do. So, there will be times when we must take a principled stand in the world. Like we draw a line in the sand and we say, I can live in this world, but I will not do that. But there will also be times that we need to have the wisdom to navigate a less than ideal world and what it means to live in that. So for Daniel and his good friends, here is where the principled stand was not. They did not take a stand against being part of the government propaganda machine. They did not take a stand against Nebuchadnezzar University. They did not take a stand against being educated in pagan ways. They did not take a stand in receiving new names that spoke to the pagan culture of the people around them. They took a principled stand with the king's food. And many of you might be going, well, if I had to make a principled stand, I would guess that I would have made that someplace else. But let me suggest that maybe it was maybe more than just eating the king's food that would have made them ceremonially unclean. I think there was a component of that. But here's what we need to understand. Eating the king's food and drinking his wine was an act of allegiance to and solidarity with the king. Eating his food was a public declaration of I am 100% all in for this guy right here. And when they would eat the king's food and publicly declare their allegiance to the king, they were saying, he gets 100% jurisdiction in my life. But they understood something more important, and the more important thing is that no matter where they were in the world, they were under the jurisdiction of God and God alone. So they would not compromise in that aspect, because they would not declare allegiance to anyone but Yahweh. So where do we make a principled stand in our world today? I think about 600 years after the book of Daniel, when the church was in its infancy. They lived in what was called the Roman Empire. And when I'm going to tell you this story, you're going to say, this sounds like Mark of the Beast sort of stuff. And maybe it was. But in order to buy, sell, or trade in the Roman world, you had to pay a tax every year. The tax was, here's your tax for being alive. And you had to go in and you had to pay that tax to a Roman soldier or a Roman a government employee. And as you paid that tax, you had to say these words: Caesar is Lord. You know what? The early church did not take a lot of principled stands. You want to know what they would not do? They would not say Caesar is Lord. And so they didn't get a white stone given to them. White stone was a little ID card that said, you're all in for Caesar as Lord. So they chose to navigate a less than ideal world by not declaring allegiance to Caesar. And so this is our bottom line, but this is what we need to understand. Our principled stand must always declare that Jesus and Jesus alone is Lord. If we're going to stand on anything in this world, this is it. And listen, I understand there's a lot of garbage in our society. There is a lot of garbage in our society. But before we speak into any of those, we have to understand this right here, is that Jesus and Jesus alone gets jurisdiction in my life. And the Caesars of this world do not. And the Caesars of this world will always ask for an allegiance from us that only Jesus deserves. And the Caesars of this world will seek power that only Jesus has. The Caesars of this world will try to make decisions in areas of ethics and morality and medicine, whatever it might be, that belongs to Jesus and Jesus alone. What I'm about to say, please do not understand as a soapbox. My problem with the American political system today, and when I say this, please understand that in my younger years, I had been called Senator Schaefer because I was that into politics even when I was in high school. My problem with our political system today is that you are either all in the political party that you declare, and you fall in line in every teeny tiny detail, or you are a pariah. And oftentimes where we take stands in our world, let's just be honest, we're towing the political line, not our allegiance to Jesus. And so as we talk about head, heart, and hands here today, determine in your mind that Jesus and Jesus alone is Lord. Determine that He gets say. And listen, there's going to be little gods everywhere. Job, career, like addiction. All these things are clamoring for saying, pick me. But we only pick Jesus. And so with that, seek wisdom in navigating a less than ideal world. Seek wisdom because it's hard sometimes. Because there's so much around us that we don't want to take part in. We don't want to associate with. We don't want to condone. So it is going to take some finesse. In fact, if we lived in an ideal world, we could take a stand about everything and it'd be good. But we don't. And so we need wisdom and we need to pray. And not just that, I'm just going to say this. Don't walk alone. One of the things that I love about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, one of the things I love about them, I think they did together what they may not have been able to do alone. And as we walk in this world, we need one another. We don't need one another because we need friends. We need one another because there's going to be times that we need somebody to say, dude, are you really living as though Jesus is Lord of your life? And sometimes we need other people who will pray for us and encourage us as we're living in this world that sometimes it's messy. And so, listen, I want to say this as I close. And I mean this with all sincerity. I don't know what my life would look like if I did not have the community of people around me that were speaking wisdom and care and really Jesus into my life on a consistent basis. Will you join me in prayer? Father, thank you. Thank you for putting us in a world that needs Jesus. Thank you for putting us in a place where we can live with wisdom and we can take the principled stand that Jesus is Lord, and ultimately our goal is to help people make that same declaration. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus Christ is Lord. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.